G'day, how's it going? My name's Rowan Mackey and I'm the Digital Media Manager at Chris Mackey & Associates Psychology Practice. This is my dad, Chris Mackey, and we do the Psych, Spiels and Silver Linings podcast. So we're super excited to be talking to you a little bit about our podcast today and bringing a little bit of it to you. So first of all, Dad, do you want to just give everyone a bit of a brief overview? What is our podcast, Psych, Spiels and Silver Linings about?
Well, we're looking to get across some optimistic mental health messages, consistent with our practice mission, which is to help people transform psychological problems into personal growth. So we take some of the most helpful kind of advice and tips and ideas that we've developed from experience of offering psychological therapy and convey that in a podcast format.
And Dad, you and I have both had our own mental health challenges in the past, haven't we? So it is also something that we like to discuss in terms of our own experience that way to try and, I suppose, destigmatise and just make the whole process a lot more relatable to people. So Dad, do you want to just give everyone a bit of a brief overview, maybe how the podcast has changed throughout this year? Because I suppose it's evolved a little bit from what we initially set out to do in the podcast.
Yes, well, we always talked earlier on about doing a podcast that's based on the principles of positive psychology and optimistic approach to mental health. But when COVID came along and we had to go through lockdown, well, we thought, well, this is a good opportunity to apply the science of well-being, positive psychology, to dealing with the adversity of lockdown. And so that's where we focused on themes related to those restrictions that we were dealing with and the stresses associated with that. But then partly as we're coming out of the first lockdown and looking more to the future, we thought, well, we might as well broaden out the themes that are very relevant to many people's mental health. Things like ways of addressing depression, anxiety, trauma reactions, anger problems, addictions, and also looking at positive ways of boosting motivation, just a range of things that we know are very helpful for our psychology practice clients and conveying those messages and making them as accessible as we can to the wider public.
And it's interesting, Dad, as well, because I must admit, when we first started the podcast, I almost wondered whether positive psychology was this kind of magical fix-all to everything and it was going to be the answer to so many things. But I think as we went along, we realised that potentially there were times when we needed to look at some of the more tried and true measures from general psychology. And although at all times it's very important to have a hopeful message, there is a lot in the podcast from general psychology that we do like to include as well. So as we say, overall hopeful message, but a range of psychological issues that we cover. But today, Dad, we're going to be giving everyone a bit of a snippet of our podcast. So do you want to just give a brief introduction to today's episode, which we're calling More Than Mindfulness?
Okay, well, part of it is mindfulness strategies and relaxation strategies are very helpful for bringing down people's tension or arousal level. And so that's one of the most basic principles and strategies that we use in clinical psychology and in psychological therapy. Many people who have difficulties like panic reactions or anger or pain, there's a component to these reactions which relates to muscle tension. And if you can bring down your level of muscle tension and lower your arousal, that tends to reduce the anxiety, the pain, the anger reaction. So we're talking about that, but we're also taking some themes, I suppose, to a further level than often they might be described when we talk about mindfulness techniques. So we're adding another layer of sophistication, you might say.
And Dad, one thing I'm really interested in talking to you today about during this episode as well is, I suppose, just the long-term effects of being, I suppose, hyper aroused over a long period of time. As we look back throughout this year, I'm not sure about everyone out there, but I can't remember, I suppose, being shocked at the news so many times. And I suppose through that there comes times of, I suppose, hyper arousal. And I know myself and many others out there are, I think, maybe feeling a bit of fatigue from that for having that for such a period of time now. So it'll be interesting to not only learn some techniques for managing our arousal, but also understanding a little bit about what can happen if we don't get on top of things in this way. So I hope everyone enjoys a little bit of our podcast. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, please catch it on our website at chrismackey.com.au/podcast. We also have a range of free resources on there as well. And with each episode, we like to pair up a couple of resources to help increase your understanding on each of the topics that way as well. So I hope everyone enjoys our little snippet of Psych, Spiels and Silver Linings. Absolutely, it will be. And that's a good little segue, actually, to get us into today's episode. So we've called it More Than Mindfulness. But what are we going to be talking about today?
Okay, now one of the most basic principles and strategies in psychological therapy is when people are experiencing distress of a certain type, like anxiety or trauma reactions or anger reactions or pain, often these reactions are associated with high arousal and a high level of muscle tension. Now, it can be difficult to think of how can we be less anxious or feel less pain or be less angry. But when we understand that there's a tension component, there's a muscle tension component that goes with the arousal, if we can learn ways of dialing down the arousal, dialing down the muscle tension, we can reduce our level of anxiety, reduce the level of pain, reduce our experience of anger. And so it's a very fundamental skill to find our ways of dialing down our arousal level. But as we'll talk about, it's not just about lowering arousal. Often people have difficulty with hyperarousal, but sometimes we can have a difficulty when there are chronic stress reactions and stress keeps on going and going. We can also experience states of hypoarousal, and that's got its complications as well. So we'll be talking about some of that as well.
And I think this is something that's I feel like we say this quite regularly, but it's something that is really important at the moment. You know, I think the term maybe got thrown around a little bit too much in terms of unprecedented. It was a word that we heard a lot at the start of the year. But at the same time, I suppose I'd almost put it in the way that I just can't remember so many times this year watching the news and almost reconceptualizing reality, if that makes sense. Like you're sort of thinking, like, my word, how on earth are we in this sort of situation? And I suppose just over the period of many months that there have been extra restrictions and that sort of thing, that sort of stuff builds up over a little while. And I think, as with many other things, as we've discussed on the podcast before, I'm someone who may have thought these things to be a little bit contrived in the past, but particularly lately, I'm really starting to learn the value in some of this sort of stuff. So yeah, really interested to talk to you about it today.
Yes, and as you mentioned, sort of some of those chronic kind of stress reactions, we'll be talking a bit about the fight-flight kind of reactions that go with high arousal, a feeling of panic, high level of anxiety, but also people can have other reactions like freezing and numbing kind of reactions. And that's where you get the hypoarousal. And there's a different way of dealing with like the freezing and numbing to how we might deal with the fight-flight kind of response. But it all does start off with that high level of arousal. If we've got ways of bringing down our arousal level with breathing techniques, relaxation techniques, and other things we talk about today, that puts us in a much better position to deal with things also like post-traumatic stress disorder or obsessive-compulsive disorder, a whole range of especially anxiety reactions influenced by this difficulty managing arousal.